Hey there, guys. So I want to thank you for taking the time to check out today's video, of course. And there's a lot of things that have been on my mind in the past week. And this was something I was pondering because you guys know that each week I try to take a few moments to think about what I want to discuss and talk about. And something I had been sort of taking time to research in between, all of the things related to building my business and just working on everything and that in itself is I do try to take time to, read, do a little bit of studying and research on different topics. And for a lot of my life, there have been times where I've sat and researched about sexuality, the Bible, and just understanding more on the context of everything when it comes to Christianity and the Bible, because as you guys know, I didn't grow up in a completely religious family per se, but we did have Christian beliefs. And a lot of the reasons why in my sort of early adult years, as well as in my teenage years, why I started to go to church regularly was because of coming out as being gay. And so that was a lot of the reasons why I was so active in church in those years. And so Christianity has been a large part of my life, of course. And so it's always been very difficult to reconcile the two. And even though I have talked about faith and sexuality in another video, in this, what I wanted to discuss was a little bit of what I've researched over the past week and really go over these points, because I think some of these points will give you guys a little bit of insight, especially if you're somebody who does struggle with basically reconciling faith alongside sexuality and sort of understanding those two elements. So what I have touched on, so I have mentioned to you guys that I had the book God and the Gay Christian. Well, I do actually have that book digitally that I've been reading on my phone, and there's a lot of really interesting concepts that book brings up when it comes to sexuality alongside the Bible itself and sort of the interpretations that are mentioned in the Bible. But another thing too, and what I did watch recently was a documentary, I believe it's called 1946, where it talks about basically when the Bible had the word homosexuality added into the sort of translation, and that was when that translation happened. This documentary is very interesting because it does go into a lot of the aspects of how this interpretation or this translation was brought into the Bible, and how basically that translation is so loose in that it's very interesting. You have to watch it, but it really says that honestly, what is translated as homosexuality is not really defined clearly in the text, whereas the text actually comes from two other different words. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to say the words correctly. There's two different words that sort of derive from the term homosexuality. And again, you guys will have to actually watch and sort of read a little bit about it. But I believe the word is arsenokoitai is one of the words. And then there's another word. I can't think of exactly what that word is. But these are basically derived from that word. But it's very odd because the words don't really fully translate to each other. But there's a whole sort of research that went into this documentary, basically explaining how homosexuality was added into the Bible in 1946, or it was translated into that word, whereas the years before it was not translated into that sort of word itself. And again, when you look at it, the definition of the word that is tied to that doesn't really connect to what we describe as homosexuality itself. It's very interesting. It's interesting about that. And like when I've mentioned before, I've always been interested in philosophy and stuff like that. And then, sexuality is something that I studied a lot too, sort of understanding what it is itself, because sexuality is it's a very deep and it can be a hard to understand concept. And I think a lot of times, or really, we don't know a lot about it. There's so much that is very, detailed about sexuality that we don't fully understand. It's like one of those things that would take years and years of research to fully understand how sexuality works and the concept behind it, things of that nature. But this documentary is really interesting how it dives into understanding sort of how this came into being and how this was translated into the Bible. And it does go into a lot of research around not only, of course, when the word homosexuality was brought into the Bible, but also the other passages that are mentioned in the Bible. That's in 1 Corinthians, that's in Timothy, that's also in Leviticus, as we know, and some of the other passages, and I believe Romans. Of course, Romans is where the term homosexuality is brought up in. But it does go over all the other passages that often get thrown around when people describe, homosexuality itself and being a sin and things of that nature. And it sort of goes into detail with that. But it's very interesting how we so much, and this is something too I've always thought about at the same time, and it does touch on this in this documentary as well as in the book God and the Gay Christian, where we emphasize so much of one single sin, especially the sin of homosexuality, and we emphasize the sin so much, a quote unquote sin, I guess I should say, and we don't even look at the context of everything else. And that's the big problem, I think, with how the way that I see it when it comes to the way, I guess you would say, conservative Christianity controls the term or controls the whole idea of homosexuality, is in itself basically creating a boogeyman. That's the way that I see it. I believe it's sort of having political leverage in a lot of ways. That's the way I've interpreted why conservative Christianity has made this sort of boogeyman when it comes to gay people and LGBTQ people in general. And that's the way that I've sort of interpreted it in a way, is that's why it's such a big deal, why it still remains a big deal, is to leverage that and to have an excuse on to use it as a political sort of power, using it for political power, in other words. So that's one of the reasons I've interpreted it that way. And again, it's very odd that we fixate on this one thing when there are so many other issues that are far worse. And two, when you think of homosexuality itself and what is mentioned in the Bible is totally different. So there's another thing that is mentioned a lot, or that is interpreted in, and it's in both the book that I mentioned, God and the Gay Christian, and in this documentary, 1946, where they mentioned that a lot of times in these more ancient cultures that they would basically use sex as sort of this degrading thing. And it wasn't necessarily for sexual gratification for like with men and men. A lot of times they would use it for a way to degrade others, not to be used in a relationship aspect as we see it today, but they would use sex, especially like higher. It is sort of in a way a patriarchal type of thing where men would basically have sex with other men to use it to degrade those other men, if that makes sense. So it was kind of used in that way in sort of more ancient times, where what we interpret sexuality in itself today and homosexuality is about a relationship and about a connection with one other person who happens to be the same sex. And of course, two consenting adults who are in a relationship. That's the way that the term of what we, define sexuality today. Whereas a lot of times what was described before is that it was described more as a way to degrade people. And that's not to say, of course, at the same time, there were, of course, gay people at that time, but they didn't really interpret it. And there are stories too that you can look up that have sort of gay romance that were sort of written in very ancient times. I need to go through, because there's a book that was given to me and I have showed pictures of it. But it's the Columbian Anthology of Gay Literature, and it kind of goes through a lot of old stories in ancient times, and it goes way back. And these are all stories of basically same-sex relationships throughout time. And it talks about those stories even like in the Bible, even in different cultures outside of our normal, like the Abrahamic religions itself. It talks about going way back, whether that be BC, AD, all of these different time frames. And so I need to read more in through that book. That book is very interesting. There's so many different stories, and it's all specifically sort of a historical context of gay people and telling gay stories throughout history. So it's very interesting because it's an anthology of different stories. But again, I definitely recommend you guys to read the book. Again, God and the Gay Christian. It is by Matthew Vines. You can also check out some of his videos. He's got really interesting videos on YouTube as well. There is a longer form video that he has, I believe that's hour long, that sort of is his sort of debate on sort of same-sex relationships and being affirming of same-sex relationships. He has a very long sort of speech that he did. And then there's also there's this organization he has called the Reformation Project. There's a lot of very interesting information on there. Again, is talking about basically more focusing on being more gay affirming, like gay affirming churches and things of that nature. And that's what this sort of organization focuses on. And again, watch the documentary I believe it is 1946. And again, this whole documentary is about when homosexuality was sort of translated in the Bible, and it goes through that whole story. But there's a lot of different things that you can research. There's a few other books that I've come across that I want to read, that I will likely discuss. This is something that I researched a lot. Like I've researched this a lot in my free time. Even when I was younger, I remember I was looking up stuff about being Christian and being gay. and just trying to find resources, because it's a very difficult and a very polarizing topic for a lot of people. And so I always, and two, because when I was growing up, there was just this, it just seemed weird with this hatred of gay people. And two, I had the self-hatred of myself. So there was a lot of different things, there was a lot of different things that I was just struggling with and going through my mind and just wondering, researching this more, that there's got to be a deeper sort of context and a deeper meaning to all this. But yeah, that's what I wanted to share today. I know that I likely was going all over the place, and I was sharing a bunch of different terms. Like I said, I'm a um, very, I guess again, I'm a deep thinker. I like to really, you know, digest a lot of information, really learn a lot of things in my own time when I can. And so this was something that I've been researching outside of all my business stuff. I try to take time at least a few minutes a day to read, and then I try to take time to sort of research different stuff and study things, because I really do like to learn different things and just understand things more, and especially something that has an impact on my life. I think it helps me. I think it gives me a sense of calm, understanding these things at the same time. But thank you guys once again for watching this video. I really enjoyed talking about this. And again, check out those two, that documentary I mentioned, as well as that book. And there's a lot of other books that I've been trying to look up, and I'll likely share a little bit more about them as I read through them. But thank you guys once again for watching. And I really look forward to sharing more, going into detail about more topics related to LGBTQ issues, and of course, giving you guys sort of an outlet and a way for you to not feel like you are alone throughout this journey. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.